My name's Dr. Paul Brewerton, the Strengths Guy, Doctor of Psychology and Chair and Founder of StrengthScope. I podcast each week just as you're getting your head back into work mode to give you a positive, strengths-based boost into your week ahead. My podcasts are packed full of tips and tools to help you get the best out of your working week. I hope you enjoy this week's podcast. Hi, my name's Dr. Paul Brewerton, the Strengths Guy, founder and chair of StrengthScope, Doctor of Organisational Psychology. And I have here with me today, I say here, she's actually 12,000 miles away, but that's as here and as near as we could get her, Rebecca Christianson. Hello, Beck.
Hi, Paul. Good evening and good morning. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, good virtual time, because this could be watched by anyone, anywhere, at any time. So it's like magic, really. Except it isn't, because it is later for you, and I appreciate that. So well, let's get on with it. Let me introduce Beck. If you don't know her, she is an executive coach, management consultant, facilitator, and keynote speaker. She's an expert on leadership and innovative HR practices. And she works as an internal HR, more typically called people and culture in Australia, exec and senior leader for over 15 years in the UK, Europe, and Australia. She then pivoted her career into private practice and now works with exec teams to help them to adapt to the changing world, which we'll talk more about today, and build leadership capability and a positive employee experience, actually all of which we'll cover today on our topic of the day. And finally, Beck also coaches senior leaders to focus on mindset shifts in order for them to thrive and in order for their teams and organizations to thrive as well. And on top of all of that, she has a psychology background and is genuinely people curious. I don't know if that's a term that will be probably in the Oxford English Dictionary next year, because I just said it and it seems like a good new word phrase thing. So we're going to talk about, it seems appropriate, it depends on when people are watching this or listening to this, if they're on the podcast, when they actually do listen, but we're going to reflect on 2022 and what the year has taught leaders and people and culture HR professionals, as well as looking ahead into 2023 with some tips from Beck, facing into next year with a clear plan for people priorities. So this is for people and culture folk, HR folk, as well as for leaders. And if you're interested in the conversations that Beck and I've had in the past, you can search the back catalogue on the Strengths Guide podcast for two conversations which link to each other. They're both on millennials at work. So there's millennial leaders, the essential guide, and also managing millennials. So if you just search on millennial, probably it will show both of those up and there won't be any others, because I think they're the only conversations I've had specifically about millennials. There's some great practical tips in there if you are interested. So that was a long intro. I'm very keen that we get started now, but it's good that we've introduced you back. I mean, at a headline level, what have been your reflections on 2022? Like, how's it been? This is a first post-COVID year, maybe, I don't know, but like, what do you, right, but it's still kind of hanging about and a whole bunch of other stuff has happened. But from your perspective, helicopter level, what's happened and what are the positives that we can take?
Sure. So I think from my perspective, I've noticed two different things going on this year. On the one hand, I've noticed a lot of organizations and leaders doing what I call I've called it like the great catch up. So this year has been the great catch up because, we lost a lot of time through leading through and managing all the COVID challenges. Yeah. And so what I've seen with some organizations and leaders is that people have had a lack of clarity in their priorities and they've just been steaming ahead trying to catch up. Yeah. It's all about catch up, and that's been pushing people and really not being clear in the spaces they want to play in. So we're seeing that, and that has really contributed, I think, to burnout at all levels.
Right. That's really interesting. So you've seen people just kind of, I suppose there's some firefighting there, and it's fires that have been burning away for a while that haven't been dealt with. Yeah. So you're having to deal with that retrospectively at the same time as looking ahead, but there's so much uncertainty. So what do I focus on? Oh, it's everything. So there's just been speed and pace, as kind of defining the last year, but a bit directionless is what I'm hearing. So that probably resonates with a lot of people. It certainly does with me.
Yeah,
That doesn't mean I'm just constantly firefighting and directionless, you understand, but it does feel like that a bit of the time. There's definitely been catch up.
It has. And I think this kind of pushing and constant striving, but almost like, again, just having this lack of North Star that people are working towards. So that's kind of on the one hand. And then on the other side, the other theme I've seen is this kind of deep reevaluation and resetting. So I've seen other organizations use this time to take a step back and think, actually, where do we want to play? What are our key business priorities? And I've also seen individuals do the same too, thinking, well, what do I want from my working world now? Because we've gone through so much, and I'm seeing people reevaluate and then reprioritize and reset based on their expectations as well. So you've almost got this one side here, which has been quite this conscious decision-making way of moving forward, and the other is just kind of in this frantic approach. And I'm seeing that they're quite different, so it's been interesting.
And it's interesting as you say that, because both of those resonate for me, and both of those resonate for a lot of people I work with, you know, senior execs I'm coaching or working with that I know. And maybe there's a bit of both in some people's lives, and maybe not enough time for the reflection and the kind of resetting because of the franticness. And then there's others who've just gone, do you know what, I'm getting off, you know, like I've had enough of this catch up, crazy, hectic kind of, you know, approach, so I'm just going to stop. And people have made very conscious decisions to do that and disengage. Not as many, I think, but you know, still, because you kind of out of necessity, people have continued more, I think, on the bus going, you know, careering forwards. But you're right. I mean, there's a lot of, well, we'll get into that, right? Because when we get into the more detail of the year, I think there's a lot to talk about. So should we do that? Should we? Is that your kind of helicopter? Because I think that's beautiful, actually. I think that's exactly. There's been this real combination of, you know, a desire to stop and a desire to continue with forward momentum out of necessity, as I say, and some tension between those two places.
Yes, yeah. And as you said, some people are stuck in one paradigm and not the other, and others, you know, there are some organizations that are kind of moving, or individuals that are moving between the two, and they're at direct contrast to each other. So it creates so much tension.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So let's get into more detail then. So what have you seen as the kind of contextual challenges, so the leadership and the business challenges in 2022? There's been many, right?
So many.
Right.
So for me, I see that there's been 7.
Wow, a number. I love it. 7, you say. This is great. Let's go through them.
So the first of all, and I think if we take a global perspective, I still think that we're, you know, managing the COVID restrictions or the leftovers from the impact of COVID. I know in Australia here, we've got a 4th wave at the moment. We've got a lot of people who are away and unwell, and different countries have had different restrictions and isolation periods. And I think that's had a lot of impact, obviously, in organizational resourcing, people showing up to be able to do their job. So I think that's been the first challenge. That's really been a legacy from the last 2 years. I know places like the UK, they've obviously stopped a lot of those restrictions years ago, but again, globally, I've got clients across the world, it's quite different. So there's that's the first one. The second one has been, there's been a lot of changes within and also to government, I think, in many different continents. So here in Australia, we've moved from a Conservative government to a Labor government in May. In the UK, you've obviously had a couple of prime ministers.
Is it that few? It feels like about 17, to be fair. You know, who is it now? Oh yeah, I know. I just, you know, for the viewers, it's Rishi Sunak.
Yeah.
Because I just had to remind myself.
Which is great. You know, he's doing a fabulous job, but you know, there's been this turmoil and change, I guess, at the top when you've got countries that are being led by different individuals. So that's the second one. The third one,
just to say on that, actually, and it's really interesting because it goes back to your helicopter view, right? I think there's something about the people when there's been an election, or even not actually, when there's been a change of leadership as a result of a party, you know, deciding that they want to have a change at the top, as there has been in the UK. But either way, that desire to push forward quickly and reflect, stop, and decide what do we really want here. I think that actually has affected the political landscape quite significantly, because it feels like both of those energies have been driving some of those changes. Like we need change, but we need consistency.
Yes.
And that's been, certainly in the UK, it's been stark in terms of how that's actually affected the economic landscape as well as the political landscape.
Right.
And socially too. I mean, there's been a lot going on. It's been very turbulent, and I'm sure that's true in many countries for sort of similar reasons. Sorry, I interrupted you. Keep going.
No, it's fine. No, and I think over here in Australia, the Labor government has been really focused around climate change, gender equity, and also integrity within government. And so that's really pushed forward particular agendas as well. So as you said, change in leadership have different priorities, and so they're kind of trudging forward. So that's added, for some sectors, they've gained a lot of positive benefits from those changes, and others, there's been perhaps deprioritization in particular areas. And then if we move to the third point, we know that there's been increasing inflation globally, and so just the cost of everything has just got so high.
Right.
And part of that.
Yeah, go on.
No, I was just saying part of that is like organizations buying part of their supply chain. Things have got more expensive to buy, so then they've had to push the price up of their products or services. And the fourth point was the war in Ukraine has obviously impacted the cost of gas and other utilities as well globally. So we've just had, the third and fourth points are just about stuff is more expensive.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, just the that's the macro picture. I guess the micro picture, a very kind of personal level, is that's then impacting obviously on people, what they have from a disposable income point of view, but also the decisions they make, even regarding work. So, deciding if they have the option of coming in or not coming into the office because of the cost of travel, has become a really significant point of discussion and consideration for people. And certainly I know at StrengthScope, not that people have necessarily talked that much about it, but certainly what we've seen post-COVID is no desire to rush back to the office. And I think in part that's because technology is enabling people to work from home, and actually people have got used to that during the COVID years. But it's also because it's an expensive thing to do, to come into the office. For many people, if not everybody, it certainly costs more than not coming into the office. So, I think there's been these micro effects that are really then, they have knock-on effects on people and culture, on HR people, and on leaders, because leading virtually or in a hybrid world is different from doing that in person, and having to learn new skills and new ways of engaging people is not without its challenges, let's say. So that's what I was going to point, and we'll cover that, I'm sure, in a wee while.
Yes, no, definitely. There's the micro impacts, and then I think with these costs and with the war in Ukraine as well, there's also been just a continued supply chain restriction. So not only do the products take longer, or the stuff that you need for your business, it also, it costs more, but it takes longer to get to as well. And so I think that's just added a lot of complexity from an operational perspective for quite a lot of sectors. As well. And when we add that then to the scarce and expensive talent globally as well, so people have been leaving. Heard a lot about the Great Resignation, and which then becomes a great attraction. So I think that's been a really interesting piece for organizations to have to challenge and to navigate around. And I think those 6 challenges have then led to a lot of organizational change. So organizations are pivoting, as one of our favorite COVID words, to need to adapt to meet the changing demands from both an internal perspective, from a people, or from an external perspective too. So there's just been a lot of overwhelming factors to manage, particularly for senior leaders. It's been a really challenging time.
So some of those changes, I mean, you kind of hinted at it, but some of them have been sort of structural, where certain maybe non-profitable areas of a business have been closed down, or smushed together because it's going to be some economies of scale, perceived economies of scale maybe, which obviously has massive people impact, in terms of creating more uncertainty, more turbulence for people. Will they have a role? What will their role involve? The number of coachees that I have now, where they've been promoted, but they've kept their old responsibilities. And, you
So
know,
common.
right,
Yeah.
it's really common. And, you know, and it is indicative of the times, you know, like how can we create some economies here? Well, this person's really good. I'm sure they can carry on doing the stuff that we see them as essential at doing. And by
Yes.
the way, let's give them a bit more money and a lot more responsibility, you know, and a change in role title. And that's adding huge pressure for leaders, I think, which I'm not sure how sustainable that is for in some cases. You know, it feels like that's the headlong rushing forward, you know, firefighting behind, left, right, and in front, and it's really hard to maintain energy on that, I think. So yeah, I'm back to your helicopter view. I'm seeing a lot of people kind of wanting to take a step off that train and have a
Yes.
proper look at where am I in all of this? Is this really what I want? Because there's so much coming at me. And I'm sure that will be true for teams and individuals as well as for leaders. So, you know, it then becomes a people and culture issue too.
Yeah, it really does. And I just think organizations have had to pivot and shift their priorities quite quickly and have needed to do that really quickly, perhaps to remain competitive. And so, yeah, I think there's just been a lot of change, and that's been fatiguing for people. And it's kind of it's a interesting caveat that kind of goes on to the next topic or the next question that we were going to.
Well, we're kind of moving into that, aren't we? So the HR challenges specifically. So that's the big picture context, and so much has happened this year. It's just crazy. You know, COVID is over. There's a war in Ukraine, right? And then everyone gets affected by that globally because of the effects it's had on fuel prices, but on all commodity prices, really. So, you know, and that's just part of it. I mean, there's been so many more than that. So how then has that translated, in your view, to people and culture challenges, to HR challenges?
Well, I think there have been five main HR challenges, which have then created almost an output of 2 extra challenges. So actually, there's been seven at play. My favorite number 7 again tonight.
It's the magic number, right? Like the psychologists say that you can remember 5 pieces of information plus or minus 2, or is it 7 plus or minus 2? Maybe it's 7.
5 plus. No, it's 5. It's 5 plus or minus 2.
There we go. So there's the 7. So hopefully people will remember all 7 all the time.
And the 2 sets of 7.
Yeah, exactly. That's fine because they're different.
So if we start with the first P&C, or sorry, HR challenge, the P&C language is a lot of what we use over here in the Pacific. But I think there's been this challenge to balance cost saving whilst also investing in talent as well. So, you know, I think leaders have had to both save money from an operational or OPEX perspective to really tightly manage their P&L, but then they also need people to support the work that needs to be done. And if you've had people leaving or people overwhelmed, you know, then you need to pay more for particularly for external candidates as well. And internal candidates also know what they're worth in the market, because we've just seen a lot of headhunting going on. So a lot of the senior people I speak to, particularly, you know, just getting constantly inundated with job requests, you know, as far as potential job opportunities. So people know what they're worth. So I think when you're, as a leader, you're trying to manage cost saving and then investing in people, and that's been a challenge.
Totally, and completely translates to our context at StrengthsGo. You know, that there has been, well, I mean, we're just constantly balancing the whole kind of pay kind of situation, and there's inflation then, you know, buffeting that as well.
Exactly.
It's really hard to, you know, to get that balance right. It's really hard to get it right, you know. So, and we're tiny and flexible, and you know, if you're a big multinational or international business, then it just gets magnified as a challenge. It's huge.
Yeah, it does. And I think that the second challenge, again, which becomes a balancing act, which is balancing business requirements also with employee needs as well. And I think that, you know, because we've got an employee voice, which has become really loud through COVID, you know, saying, this is what I need, this has been really hard. And organizations have been willing to listen more. So we're seeing a much greater focus on employee experience principles, where their organizations are generally asking and co-designing different people initiatives to meet their people's needs. But on the other hand, then you've got these business challenges that are taking place, and the business needs to pivot. And some of those changes might not actually resonate with people either. So again, you've got executive teams trying to balance these two. So how do we keep the business sustainable and in operation, whilst also our people are telling us they need this to be successful? and how do we move them forward to the future of work in a way that is more sustainable long term? I think that's been, again, a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Fully agree. What's number 3?
And number 3, I think because we've seen the shift in remote working and hybrid working, there's just been such an evolution around the role of a leader and what people expect of leaders. And so, how do you support leaders to be effective and lead a high-performing, engaged team in a remote work environment? That's been really hard for a lot of even very strong leaders. They've had to adapt. And I think the HR function has had to do a lot to coach leaders in that space. But also because we've experienced such hardships the last 2 and a bit years, people are looking for a human-centered leader.
Yeah,
they want someone who is authentic, who's empathetic, but who's adaptable as well. And I think for me, those are the 3 key traits that leaders really need right now. And I was at a leaders breakfast a few weeks ago where I was speaking, and I heard it from a lot of execs just saying our leaders are really struggling with this. It's been 2 and a bit years, and we're really seeing some flourish and a lot struggling. So I think that's just been a constant challenge for organizations too.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, and as ever, it's a great challenge to work out how on earth you provide that that leadership development, right? I mean, do you do it by cohort? Do you do it across the board? Do you do it through coaching so it's individual, but actually everybody needs it? And what is it anyway? Like, it's really hard, I think, as a challenge for HR pros and people and culture professionals. It's one of the most difficult things to get right, and I think it's still being probably taken leader by leader rather than across the board.
Great.
But I'm sort of seeing a little bit more of a recognition that everybody probably needs a bit of this now, because it's staying. Hybrid working is here to stay, and therefore hybrid leadership needs to be acknowledged.
Exactly. And because we've got a lot of younger millennials and Gen Zs entering the workforce, they want a leader who is authentic. They don't want the corporate facade. They don't want that BS. They want someone who genuinely cares about them. And so the old paradigm of leadership, which is hierarchical, just doesn't, it's just not relevant anymore.
Okay.
And I think the 4th challenge has just been around attracting great talent. That's been really hard for organizations to work out, what do we offer from a remuneration perspective? And how do we adapt our EVP as well? So our employee value proposition. Right. Some have been really, really proactive in realizing what candidates and their people want and adapting that. And others are just thinking, no, this is who we are. This is what we do.
Yeah.
If you like it or kind of lump it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the 5th challenge has been to how we engage and retain employees that are really change fatigued as well.
Yes.
And I think that's been a key challenge, because I think that there's been a lot of pivoting, but a lot of just one more stretch project, just one more zone where we can push ourselves. And that just keeps on happening based on my kind of earlier point in the conversation. And people are getting fatigued and burnt out. And so some organizations are investing a lot in the well-being and resilience space. And I'll talk a bit more about my thoughts around that. But I think some functions have been more vulnerable to fatigue. So some of the functions like the HR function, the technology function, who's had to step up to enable organizations to be able to work remotely, and finance team. Like, I think there's a lot of corporate functions, and especially our frontline workers as well, in healthcare settings, they're just exhausted. And I think it's been really challenging to give them the space that people need to recharge whilst also continue to juggle all the competing priorities.
Absolutely. So you said there were 5, and then that has led to another 2.
Yeah. So I think what those 5 have led to then, the 6th point is around what we're seeing is the quiet quitting or the actual quitting. Right. So the quiet quitting is where people stay in their roles, but they reduce their discretionary effort. And so they do what they need to do. And I think that organizations are realizing that how much work they got done based on people's discretionary effort and going above and beyond. So I'm seeing the impact then from a deliverable perspective, from that perspective. And we're just finding people leaving because, again, they're in that reflection, resetting their working life. And they've gone in search of greater pastures where they feel like there's a better value match between what they want for work and what an organization will offer.
Yeah.
And it's created the 7th point, which is burnout. So I'm hearing people use that. Some people might say it's being used too casually now, but I actually think there's a level of ownership where people feel comfortable saying it now. 3 years ago, that was a dirty word, but people are openly saying, like, I'm really struggling.
Literally last night or yesterday afternoon, conversation with somebody, and it's exactly what you just said. So they said, I've reached the point of burnout. They knew they had. And emotionally, I could see that. And they were showing that and sharing that and openly, right? And I think that's absolutely, by the way, that's a friend who I was talking to in a corporate, and they know that here it's like Christmas is coming. There's the Christmas holidays coming, so it's like, well, let me just kind of keep going for the next 10 days or the next 7 days or whatever. But I think people recognize they have a choice in that, and that actually, if they wanted to, they could now say, do you know what? I need to go. I need to actually spend that extra 7 days reflecting and getting well again. Because I know where I am, Not everyone has that level of self-awareness. I think there's a lot of people who, still will keep going far beyond the time when they should have stopped. But you're absolutely right. Increasingly, people are more aware of where they're at from a sort of emotional and fatigue perspective, and they're far more comfortable calling it out and saying, I just need to stop. So and quite frankly, if you don't let me, well, I'm gonna quit or quit. Is the kind of is the assumption these days. So that's but I completely agree. I think it's far more prevalent, and it's far more sort of discussable, which is it's not great that it's prevalent, but it's great that it's being talked about and dealt with better.
Exactly, because there are such mental health implications for burnout, because it has both a physical and emotional, as you said, impact. And I guess what I'm seeing also in a lot of senior leadership groups or leaders is, actually quitting. So, I've got a number of clients, whether they're within organizations I've worked with or coaching clients that I've worked with, who are just leaving with no job to go to, who are taking 6 months off to have a sabbatical. And even people, at middle leadership level here, over here, again, they're just leaving with no job to go to. And obviously that requires a level of financial privilege to take some time out. But there's this readiness to say, I don't want this anymore, and I don't know what I want. So I'm actually going to take some time out and travel, or just be with my family, or just rest, So I think people are really putting themselves first, which I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you. So it's good talking about that, because we were talking then, it wasn't exclusively about leaders. It could be anyone, anywhere, right, that experiences burnout. But is there anything specific that you want to cover around you kind of hinted, and we talked about millennials a little bit earlier, and we talked about our previous podcast, but, the leadership landscape has been changing, more female leaders than ever, more millennial leaders than ever. And that's going to clearly continue as a trend, of course, because it's just an inevitability. I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's like within 4 years, it's something like, I don't know, 2/3 are going to be millennial and
they're saying about between 4 to 8 years. Yeah.
So it becomes far, the millennial leadership population then becomes the majority. So how do you feel those groups of leaders have responded to the challenges that we've been talking about up to now?
I think, and I know we're going to talk about generalizations in from a generational perspective, but I am seeing a difference in leadership style. So I'm seeing the gap between this old paradigm of leadership and the new paradigm of leadership. And a lot of women, and again, millennial leaders, as you said, they're really embracing those 3 leadership traits I mentioned, authenticity, empathy, and adaptability. And I'm seeing them have an impact on their teams, because they're increasing the psychological safety around them. They're being really, being conscious of creating diverse teams and increasing inclusion. So with a lot of these social movements that have been happening outside in the community, people are coming in to the organization expecting to be included, and so they should. And so I'm seeing that increase the level of diversity of thought and also just the innovation within teams, because you're not just hiring people like you. And so I think this contrast between the old and the new world is becoming more and more prevalent. And then we see that from an organizational perspective, where organizations then are becoming more innovative and more people focused. And, we've got organizations shifting to 4-day working weeks and, really pushing the boundaries from an employee experience perspective to make that really positive. And others that are like, I just want to go back to what it was like in, 2019. And again, the landscape is, you've got these such extremes now, and obviously a continuum in between. It's really interesting.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely agree. I think that's exactly right. Nailed. Again, there's this continuum, but actually more of a binomial distribution, said the statistician in his house. But yeah, I mean, so it's kind of at both ends. There's like there's a lot, and then in the middle, perhaps not so much, because people are one way or the other in the way that they're thinking about this. So just to urge on authenticity, because it comes up a lot, and I think there's also another element that I'd like to just speak to briefly, and maybe it's a little bit less far along perhaps than authenticity in terms of its currency, but privilege, is what I wanted to mention, because there's an acknowledgement that I think increasingly, for some leaders, that being authentic, you also have to recognize the privilege that you have, and that the point at which you're at, rather than just being authentic 100% you 100% of the time, because of course that can be counterproductive. So I keep talking about, and there's got to be a better phrase than this, but like smart authenticity or situational authenticity, which sounds like non-authenticity at all. It sounds inauthentic, but it's not true, because you have to recognize the audience you're with. If you want to create psychological safety, you can't come at it fully authentic, all guns blazing, as home you all of the time as a leader. If you want to get the best results for a team, you've got to be cognizant of who's in the room, who's your audience, who are you with, and where are there differences in privilege, differences in kind of hierarchical position, but not just that. Like there's if you want to promote diversity of thinking, you've got to make sure that you're being inclusive, and not just having diversity in the room. You've got to genuinely understand how that dynamic works, and that takes a lot of effort. And I think for many leaders, they're on that journey. For probably a significant minority, maybe even still the majority, there's work to do, on that score, and to face into, to kind of. But you're absolutely right around, female leaders and millennial leaders generally tend to be more aware of those issues, which is a real positive, I think, for the workplace as a whole.
Definitely, because I think as you're a leader, you have that hierarchical privilege, as you said, and so understanding where the minority majority groups sit within your team and in the different social and work settings you're in is really important to be able to be an ally. And I think, for me as a female leader, so when I was senior leader, I was often the only woman at the table, or, there was a couple of us, and I worked with, a rest of, some fantastic men, but I was often a minority. And so because I've been a minority myself, as you get more and more senior, you become really conscious of being on the lookout for other people who are in the minority, and also they have very different views, and we need that to be able to build different ways of working and to evolve organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So any tips then, as we're talking about leaders, based on your reflections from 2022? So have you got any kind of broad themes, any sort of specific tips?
Yes, I might divide my tips, if that's okay, into kind of attraction and then retention, if that's
that's good.
Yeah. So from an attraction perspective, I think it's really important to be able to apply employee experience principles, and that is to be able to segment your workforce, whether it's your future workforce or your current workforce, to be able to understand what they really want. And like McKinsey have looked at 5 different worker profiles. There's lots of different ways you can segment your base. And I think, we really want to get below the surface to understand what groups of people want and need. I think that's really important. That's one of my tips.
Yeah, I like that. And probably not an easy thing if you don't know how. So we'll leave your details later for everybody. But that sounds really important, and doing that kind of segmentation piece, I'm not sure that many people will know how.
Yes, because when you first segment your employee base, and then you run focus groups and one-to-one interviews, and then you create employee personas and you do employee journey maps, and that helps you understand this group of people better. And then I've been doing quite a lot of work this year in then developing EVP messaging based on those persona and those segment work.
Yeah,
so
fantastic.
It does take a little bit of effort, but you get such richness and depth around.
Yeah, and it almost. Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like more of a necessity now than ever. I mean, when we've got people who are expecting to have more individuated experience, there's an expectation that they're going to be understood, and that feels like a really good way of getting closer to that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think my second tip around attraction would be, I just think we need to be more creative in the way that we cut roles as well. I just think there's a lot of, particularly women, who are working part-time or want to work part-time but can't quite find the right gig. Like I know quite a lot of my friends, in really big roles, and then a lot of the senior roles are being offered full-time. And I just think we need to get more creative about how we can support women work part-time, but also men too, because we've got a really big change in the landscape of the way co-parenting works. And I just think organizations always think about full-time roles, and they're not being creative to tap into different talent pools. So I think that would help us attract more people to our organization.
It's a great tip. And I think if nothing more, it will start to stimulate that in terms of an expectation, which in itself is a good thing. If you do want to work 3 days a week or 4 days a week or 4.5 days a week, whatever, 9-day fortnights, then the option is there, and it becomes more the norm, because at the moment I don't think it is. I think you're right, people are still kind of locked in older way, kind of the old paradigm around that a little bit too much.
Yeah. And then from a retention perspective, I think it's really critical to rethink an organization's priorities, and that then links to how we can support our people to be more well and to have greater resilience. And I think a lot of organizations are taking, they're running a lot more wellbeing programs, which is excellent. I'm not criticizing people's efforts, but often they're to cover up high workloads and high stress.
Right.
And
I'm pleased you say that, because resilience as a word is sort of almost implies you need to be tougher. Let me put you on a resilience workshop, and I think
it's your fault.
Yeah, and I think there's always value in those initiatives.
Of course.
However, it needs to be considered, I think, how it might be received. That if let me put you on another resilience, I think you need a resilience workshop. Yeah, okay. Well, as you say, it's my fault. I think actually when you look at the workload, right? That's
And I think that goes back to priority setting. But again, often organizations, and the traditional definition of resilience is around being able to bounce back. But actually, when we look at some of the current research, we know that people can't go on and push themselves and stretch themselves consistently from a workload perspective. You need rest, right? You need rest. And I think a more helpful definition of resilience is actually it's the relationship between an individual and the system that they're a part of, right? And so that puts some responsibility back to the system, which is the organization, on are they creating the right conditions to support resilience? And yes, there are internal resources that people can draw from to be resilient. And part of that is mindset. So some resilience sessions can be really helpful, but also resilience requires an access to external resources as well. And then again, that's part of the responsibility sits in the team or the organization or the system. And so I think that this is not a nice message that a lot of exec teams want to hear from me. Like, I really feel like they struggle when I might hold the mirror up to say, like, this is what some of the current research is saying around resilience, that you're putting it all back on the employee. And, there needs to be a two-way dialogue and an honest dialogue around what's realistic workload for people to manage based on what they've been going through the last 2-3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we're back to that balancing the needs of the employee against the needs of the business, which is a really hard line to walk, but it's necessary, and effective leadership requires that.
Yes, yeah. And the second point then to leave you, and the last point around retention, is what I'm seeing is a lot of organizations having what they call stay conversations. So leaders are having a stay conversation to say, it's like a check-in. How are you going? What's really important to you? And actually listening and being curious in in the one-to-one responses, and we know we can get intel from an employee engagement surveys, but pulse surveys, but they give us such broad ranges, and the individual view gets lost in that with the majority. And so connecting with your people one-to-one, I think, is really important to understand what else people need to be successful.
Yeah. And I think the challenge for leaders with that often is not quite knowing how to face into those conversations, not knowing quite how to say it or frame it, because there's a fear of getting it wrong or asking an inappropriate question. There's a fear of that. But I think increasingly with the change in workforce that we've been talking about, the change in leaders that we've been talking about, that those conversations fortunately are happening more. But I definitely, as you're saying, is to encourage leaders to do that. And if they get it wrong, it's still worth saying, it's still worth asking. But it also there's a thing about thinking about how you're going to ask those questions and how you're going to check in as to how someone actually is, which takes a little bit of preparation. You're not going to get the greatest answer from how you're doing, because the answer is likely to be fine. You need to go further than that, but you need to do it with sensitivity, and it's going to depend on the individual you're speaking with. But I fully endorse and agree that that's a necessary conversation now, for people, and they've got to feel that they have psychological safety if they're going to be honest and open, and that will come with time and with trust. It won't come instantly, and it's not a tick box. It's a real human connection type conversation, which is easier for some leaders than others, I think.
Definitely, and needs to be led with vulnerability themselves as a leader. So I think that's definitely all those points are really important.
Very, very good point. Okay, so thank you. That's amazing. I just got a sense there's probably more that you could have added in there in terms of tips, but if there is, then we can put those in the show notes, and that can come out. Thinking now, we've gone through 2022, and there's a lot there in terms of the potential for what 2023 is going to bring. But what do you think will be the key trends into 2023 from a people perspective for leaders and for HR, people and culture professionals to be aware of?
Yeah, I think there are 6. So I had 2 7s at the beginning, and now I've got 6.
Okay, that's good. I can remember all of these, I'm sure of it.
So I think particularly, being able to build a diverse, equitable and inclusive culture. And we've talked quite a bit about that around psychological safety and understanding minority majority groups and being an ally, but particularly focusing on everyday micro behaviors. So I'm seeing a lot of organizations trying to make really big organizational gestures in this space, and then it's not getting followed up in an everyday way by leaders. So I think encouraging leaders focusing on their everyday behaviors with their teams. What are they doing on a day-to-day basis to support that inclusivity within their team? That's absolutely paramount. I think secondly, just continuing to build leadership capability and evolve the role of a leader and what people need from leaders now, based in the VUCA 2.0 world that we're in, is I think a second priority that will just continue into the new year. And thirdly, I think embedding flexible and hybrid remote working, just being here to stay. I'm seeing a lot of organizations kind of change their approach and be really unsure. I just think people need to make decisions and commit to that from an organizational perspective. And, remote working is here to stay. People really want it. And I know it's not possible in some, customer-facing roles, but where it is possible, people really want it. And people can't forget what they had for the last few years. The fourth point leads to my a topic I mentioned before, which is about being really clear on your priorities to be able to support people to have that clear line of sight, but also better manage workloads and reduce stress and burnout. Fifth, that then links a nice segue to rethink organizations' approach to well-being and resilience. So are you using it as a Band-Aid solution to cover up a lot of stress and pressure? And what are you genuinely doing? And how is that a two-way process to support the well-being of your people? I think that will continue to be a theme next year. And the sixth point was around how we can reshape and prioritize workplace learning again. I just think that development has been put on the back burner a bit because there's just been these competing demands. Yet that's the reason why people are leaving. They're going to bigger jobs or more career development opportunities. So I think organizations really need to reprioritize that again.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I'm really pleased you said that. I think it is a reason for leaving. You know, people are, if they're feeling, actually, I'm not going to get the opportunities here for me to stretch and grow and learn, I'm going to go somewhere. And that doesn't mean, you know, because I'm going to go to this role because they've got this amazing online learning portal that I can access. It's actually, I'm going there because it's going to help me in my career. And, you know,
yes,
that's the thinking I think you're asking organizations to do. You know, it's sort of thinking development in the broadest sense, you know, in terms of
yes,
opportunities for people from a learning perspective. Okay, cool.
definitely.
So that's absolutely packed, right? I mean, like, there's so much there, and I think this is well worth the rewind and you know, kind of real consideration of each of those points for people. I wonder, have you got anything that will help people as they go into, hopefully for some, depending on when you're listening to this, a period where they're able to sort of stop and think a little bit. You know, what are your tips on from all that we've talked about, you know, for leaders and for HR professionals today?
Yeah, I think there's probably 3 takeaways, and I'm calling them the 3 R's at the moment. And I've been speaking a lot to my clients the last month about them. That is recharge, reflect, and reset.
Right.
And so I think, as you know, we're coming to a bit of a break period. I think it's been a tough year. So being able to prioritize our own rest and recharge to fill our own cup, I think is really important. To set some boundaries with friends, family, work to enable us to be able to do that. That would be my first tip.
Yeah.
The second tip then is to reflect, you know, what are you really proud of that you achieved this year as a leader, and how have you changed through the challenges that you've had to work through, and reflect on what you think your people need and what are the really key priorities, because the third point is about resetting priorities for next year. And what I'm seeing a lot of teams do at the moment is they're just transferring all the priorities from 2022 into 2023 without this kind of conscious deliberation and kind of a really macro discussion about what do we really need to achieve for our business success, and what do we expect from our people. And I really think organizations need to reset their priorities. So we're not having another year of the great catch up, just to push people in even further.
Yeah, perfect. Amazing. Thank you so much. There's so much content in what you've talked about. Each point, you know, there's so much depth there. So I really appreciate you doing the thinking on this, you know, giving your wisdom, and just taking the time and spending the time. And it's getting later and later for you where you are. So I will draw things to a close so that you can maybe have, you know, a bit of an evening. Who knows? Whatever you choose to do. But thank you, Beck. That's been incredible, really helpful, very practical, and, you know, hopefully it's going to give people something to reflect on as they go into next year and start to reset their priorities, as you say. Your contact details we'll put out in the show notes. But do you want to just, you know, do you want to mention that now, or should we'll put them in the show notes and let people find them if they need them? That'll be in the blog section.
Yes, yeah, I think people can contact me via LinkedIn or my website or email. But, you know, if you're a leader and you've listened to this and you're looking for some support from, you know, executive coaching perspective, I have coachees in Australia, in the UK, in Europe, and in Asia as well. So I kind of have a global, I call myself an international executive coach. So if people are looking for support to help reset themselves in 2023, then I would love to hear from you.
No, that's fantastic. I love that as well. An international executive coach. I've never heard that before. That's really cool. So many phrases that you need to immediately trademark. I love it. It's the 3 R's as well, with a registered trademark at the end. Love it. Awesome. Thank you, Beck. That's it for this week. Don't forget, there's you know, the earlier conversations that Rebecca and I have had on millennial leaders and managing millennials. So check those out, and the back catalogue of the Strengths Guy as well. So thanks very much for listening, and that's it for this week. So till next time, stay strong.
Thank you everyone. Take care. Cheers for listening. Cheers.